5. Military intelligence. The military intelligence organization of World War II consisted of a variety of field units, ranging from groups serving with combat commands to the special staffs designed to assist Allied Combined Operations Councils at the highest levels of armed services leadership. The core, or hub, of this complex of overseas intelligence entities was the Military Intelligence Division of the War Department General Staff, an agency which, in the twilight peace of 1938, consisted of 20 officers and 48 civilians. Footnote: U.S. Army Military Intelligence Division. A History of the Military Intelligence Division, 7th of December 1941 to 2nd of September 1945. Typescript, 1946, page 3. Copies of this study bear the marking Secret. The copy utilized in this study was declassified and supplied by the Office of the Secretary of Defense, hereafter referred to as MID History. End footnote. Quote, when the United States entered the war, the Military Intelligence Division was ill-prepared to perform the tasks which were to be thrust upon it. The war in Europe and the increasingly critical world situation had increased the number of persons employed in the division and had added a few new activities. Despite the expansion, there were real deficiencies, which indicate the condition of the division at the end of 1941. There was no intelligence on enemy air or ground order of battle. There was no detailed reference material on enemy army forces, such as weapons, insignia, fortifications, and documents. There was no detailed topographic intelligence for planning landing operations. There were insufficient facts, but plenty of opinion on which to base strategic estimates, and there were no trained personnel for either strategic or combat intelligence. The production and planning of intelligence was proceeding, but on a limited scale and to an insignificant degree. Fortunately, most of this material could be obtained from our allies, but it no more than satisfied current intelligence requirements and was completely inadequate for long-range requirements. Before VJ Day, the division had developed into a large and efficient intelligence organization, but this development, like the building of Rome, did not take place overnight. Present estimates indicate that an efficient intelligence machine was not developed until late 1944. End quote. Appointed Chief of the Operations Division, successor to the War Plans Division, of the War Department General Staff in March 1942, Major General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the man destined to command Operation Torch and serve as Supreme Commander of the European Theater, made the following observation with regard to intelligence operations and capabilities during the period of America's entry into World War. Quote, within the War Department, a shocking deficiency that impeded all constructive planning existed in the field of intelligence. The fault was partly within and partly without the Army. The American public has always viewed with repugnance everything that smacks of the spy. During the years between the two world wars, no funds were provided with which to establish the basic requirement of an intelligence system, a far-flung organization of fact-finders. Our one feeble gesture in this direction was the maintenance of military attachés in most foreign capitals, and since public funds were not available to meet the unusual expenses of this type of duty, only officers with independent means could normally be detailed to these posts. Usually they were estimable, socially acceptable gentlemen. Few knew the essentials of intelligence work. Results were almost completely negative, and the situation was not helped by the custom of making long service as a military attaché rather than ability the essential qualification for appointment as head of the intelligence division in the War Department. The stepchild position of G2 in our general staff system was emphasized in many ways. For example, the number of general officers within the War Department was so limited by peacetime law that one of the principal divisions had to be headed by a colonel. Almost without exception, the G2 division got the colonel. This in itself would not necessarily have been serious, since it would have been far preferable to assign to the post a highly qualified colonel than a mediocre general, but the practice clearly indicated the Army's failure to emphasize the intelligence function. This was reflected also in our schools, where, despite some technical training in battlefield reconnaissance and intelligence, the broader phases of the work were almost completely ignored. We had few men capable of analyzing intelligently such information as did come to the notice of the War Department, and this applied particularly to what has become the very core of intelligence research and analysis, namely industry. In the first winter of the war, these accumulated and glaring deficiencies were serious handicaps. Initially, the Intelligence Division could not even develop a clear plan for its own organization, nor could it classify the type of information it deemed essential in determining the purposes and capabilities of our enemies. The chief of the division could do little more than come to the planning and operating sections of the staff and, in a rather pitiful way, ask if there was anything he could do for us. End quote. Footnote: Dwight D. Eisenhower, Crusade in Europe, New York, Doubleday and Company, 1948, page 32. The chronology of organizational developments in the military intelligence structure necessarily focuses upon the Military Intelligence Division, beginning with the final months before the Pearl Harbor attack. In September 1941, the Military Intelligence Division was organized vertically and prepared not only to produce intelligence, but also to expand in case war came. The Assistant Chief of Staff, G2, Brigadier General Sherman Miles, was chief of the division and was assisted by an executive. Reporting directly to him was the Special Study Group, later the Propaganda Branch. Reporting to him through the executive were the chiefs of the administrative, intelligence, counterintelligence, plans and training, and censorship branches. The administrative branch included two types of functions. Such sections as finance, personnel, records, and coordination comprised the first type. By this consolidation of administrative functions, the remaining branches of the division were free to devote their full energies to their primary functions. This branch also was charged with the administrative supervision of the military attaché system, the foreign liaison, and translation sections. The heart of the Military Intelligence Division was in the Intelligence Branch, the largest of the branches. Organized along geographic lines, it controlled, in a large measure, all of the processes of intelligence. Information was gathered and evaluated, and intelligence produced by the following 7 sections: the Balkans and Near East, the British Empire, Central Europe, Eastern Europe, Far East, Latin America, and Western Europe. It will be noted that the lines of demarcation were entirely geographical, and that there was no attempt to separate information and intelligence topically according to political, economic, scientific, and so on. The Air Section, and later the Order of Battle Branch, were exceptions to this rule. Intelligence was disseminated by the Dissemination Section and by the G2 Situation Section, which maintained the G2 Situation Room. The information gathering activities of military attachés, observers, and others working in the field were directed by the Field Personnel Section. This included directives concerning the types of information desired, but did not embrace administrative matters, which were left to the Military Attaché Section of the Administrative Branch. In other words, the attachés looked to the Administrative Branch for their administration, to the Intelligence Branch for their directives, and reported their findings to the geographic sections. To assist the chief of the Intelligence Branch in administrative matters, there was a small administrative group within the branch. It will be noted that the branch controlled all of the processes of intelligence, and that it was devoted entirely to positive intelligence, as opposed to negative or counterintelligence. End quote. Footnote: MID History, pages 6 and 7. End footnote. Organized functionally, the counterintelligence branch, composed of domestic intelligence, investigation, and plant intelligence sections, probed subversion and disloyalty matters, supervised defense plant security, produced intelligence relative to the domestic situation, was responsible for safeguarding military information and took on such special assignments as were given to it. The Plan and Training Branch, quote, prepared plans for intelligence requirements and developed policies for military and combat intelligence, end quote, while also being, quote, responsible for the development and supervision of training doctrine in the fields of military and combat intelligence, end quote. Until the United States actually entered the war, the Censorship Branch, renamed the Information Control Branch on December 5, 1941, remained small and confined itself to preparing plans for future censorship. Because national censorship in wartime was not assigned to the War Department, G2 was responsible only for military censorship policy through liaison with the Office of Censorship, which provided MID with valuable information uncovered by that agency. Footnote: the censorship of communications between the United States and foreign nations was authorized by the First War Powers Act, approved December 18, 1941. Pursuant to this statute, President Roosevelt, on December 19th, established the Office of Censorship, a civilian agency located within the National Defense Program tangentially attached to the Executive Office of the President. The director of the Office of Censorship and its program was Byron Price, who headed the unit until its demise by a presidential directive issued September 28, 1945, and effective on November 15th of that year. See Elmer Davis and Byron Price, War Information and Censorship, Washington, American Council on Public Affairs, 1943. Also see Byron Price, Governmental Censorship in Wartime, American Political Science Review, v. 36, October 1942, 837 through 850. End footnote. In early 1942, a reorganization occurred within the War Department, a restructuring which would prove functionally troublesome for MID. Quote, the new organization was announced to the Army in Circular No. 59. As it affected the Army, its changes were far-reaching and fundamental. The most striking feature of the proposed reorganization was the distinction made between operating and staff functions. The latter were to be retained by the General Staff Division, but the former were to be placed in operating agencies. This entailed the separation of the larger part of the organization of each staff division from the small policymaking group who performed truly staff functions. The policy groups would remain in the General Staff as a small policymaking and advisory staff divorced from the operating functions of their organizations. By ruthlessly regrouping many old offices and functions and integrating them into the new organization, smoother functioning was expected. The language of the circular did not make a clear distinction between the old policymaking Military Intelligence Division and the newly created operating Military Intelligence Service. From the present point of vantage, the intentions of the circular seem clear. This distinction was not made completely clear until Circular 5-2, September 1944, was issued, although some progress had been made in the July 1942 revision of AR 10-15. Circular No. 59 charged the Military Intelligence Division, G2, with those duties of the War Department General Staff relating to the collection, evaluation, and dissemination of military information. The Military Intelligence Service was established under the direction of the Assistant Chief of Staff, Military Intelligence Division, War Department General Staff, to operate and administer the service of the collection, compilation, and dissemination of military intelligence. Here was a verbal paradox. In the vocabulary of G2, intelligence is based upon the evaluation of information. Information is the raw product from which intelligence is produced. The Military Intelligence Division was charged, then, with duties relating to the evaluation and dissemination of information, while the Military Intelligence Service was not charged with the evaluation, but with the dissemination of intelligence. End quote. Footnote: MID History, pages 12 and 13. End footnote. Subsequent discussions and attention to this verbal dilemma contributed to a clarification of the functions of MID and MIS, but the initial confusion and lack of an authoritative decision on the matter did little to ameliorate ill feelings over the dichotomous organization and subsequent rivalry between the two units. Quote, a series of office memoranda implemented the reorganization directed by Circular No. 59. The Military Intelligence Service was created, and all personnel, except certain commissioned officers, were transferred to it from the Military Intelligence Division. An examination of the personnel assignments in the memoranda and of assignments listed on a chart of 15th of January 1942 reveals few essential changes. Colonel Hayes A. Kroner, the new Chief, Military Intelligence Service, had been Chief of the Intelligence Branch. Colonel Ralph C. Smith, the new Executive Officer, Military Intelligence Service, had been Executive Officer and Chief, Administrative Branch. The latter function was assigned to Colonel T. E. Roderick, formerly Assistant Executive. He likewise retained his assignment as Assistant Executive Officer. The new Chief Intelligence Group, Colonel R. S. Bratton, had formerly been assigned to the Far East section of the Intelligence Branch. Chief of the Training Branch, Lieutenant Colonel P. H. Timothy, had been Chief of the Plans and Training Branch. Colonel Oscar Solbert, now Chief of the Psychological Warfare Branch, was a past member of that branch. Colonel Black, its former chief, had been transferred to the Military Intelligence Division Staff Section. Other members of the staff were either newly assigned members of the Military Intelligence Division, detailed from the AAF, or members of the Military Intelligence Division. The Military Intelligence Service was divided into 4 groups, each reporting to the Chief, Military Intelligence Service, through his executive. The Foreign Liaison Branch and the Military Attaché Section reported independently to the Chief, Military Intelligence Service, and not through a deputy. The administrative group was divided into 5 housekeeping sections. The intelligence group was divided into parallel air and ground sections, organized according to theaters. In addition, an administrative branch and a situation and planning branch assisted in the supervision and planning for the group. The counterintelligence group was divided into parallel air and ground sections devoted to domestic, plant intelligence, military censorship, and security of military information. They, too, were coordinated by an administrative and a counterintelligence situation and evaluation branch. Psychological warfare, training, and dissemination were assigned to the operations group. End quote. Footnote. Another account comments that after March 1942, there was a small military intelligence division of the War Department General Staff totaling 16 officers with 10 clerical assistants, and a military intelligence service consisting of 342 officers and 1,005 civilian and enlisted assistants. The service was to carry out the operational and administrative activities for the General Staff Section, and while there were to be 2 distinct agencies, some of the key officers were members of both organizations. This differentiation tended to be an artificial distinction, and in practice, there was but one organization. From Otto L. Nelson, Jr., National Security and the General Staff. Washington, Infantry Journal Press, 1946, page 525. End footnote. 3 months after Circular No. 59 was implemented, the new Assistant Chief of Staff, G2, Major General George V. Strong, whom Eisenhower described as a senior officer possessed of a keen mind, a driving energy, and a ruthless determination, indicated his dissatisfaction with the reorganization as it affected MID and offered an alternate plan of structure to the Chief of Staff. Quote, it was essentially the same organization as before, except that the Office of Chief Military Intelligence Service had been established between most of the branches and the G2. The Military Intelligence Division staff, aside from the Military Intelligence Service, was new. The most apparent difference between the old and new plan was the separation of ground and air intelligence into parallel sections within intelligence and counterintelligence. As before, a group was established which met in the Situation Room to make the final evaluation and to conduct broad planning and policy making. Preliminary work of this sort was also done in the Situation and Planning sections and the Evaluation section of the Intelligence and Counterintelligence groups. Because the final evaluation process was entrusted to the G2 General Staff, there was no clear break between the Military Intelligence Division and the Military Intelligence Service. General Strong believed in organizing the division functionally and sought, therefore, to place evaluation in the intelligence group. In July, according to present evidence, the dissemination branch was combined with certain other functions and designated the evaluation and dissemination branch, probably in the intelligence group. The date is uncertain, but the G2 telephone directories for June and July indicate that this must have been the date. It was an agency which evaluated the overall information collected within the group and disseminated it as intelligence. In October, its name was changed to the Dissemination Group, and it was placed in the Intelligence Group. At the same time, the Intelligence Group was divided into the newly created North American and Foreign Intelligence Command and the American Intelligence Command. The two commands gave the Military Intelligence Service the means to handle, on the one hand, all intelligence affecting Latin America, American Intelligence Command, and all other types of foreign intelligence, North American and Foreign Intelligence Command on the other." End quote. Other changes in the intelligence structure were effected, such as the decentralizing of the American Intelligence Command and relocating it in Miami. Quote, "By 29th of November 1942, arrangements were sufficiently stable to issue a chart showing the various changes. The G2 staff was retained, and the Chief Military Intelligence Service was also designated as Deputy G2. The Executive Office now appeared to supervise the Message Center. The Chief Military Intelligence Service was given 4 assistant chiefs for intelligence, training, administration, and security. The intelligence group was divided into the 2 commands mentioned above. North American and Foreign Intelligence Command was organized geographically, with a separate air section further subdivided into general geographic sections. American Intelligence Command was organized more functionally, with branches devoted to special activities: American, air control, communications control, and hemisphere studies. The dissemination group was so placed that its cable, collection, theater, intelligence, and publications branches received reports from both commands. At the top of this pyramid was the Evaluation Board, which reported to the Assistant Chief Military Intelligence Service, Intelligence, and could receive reports from the aforementioned commands and groups. The training agency was divided into 2 groups, one for intelligence schools and the other for liaison with other schools and agencies concerned with intelligence training. The Assistant Chief Military Intelligence Service Administration was given certain operational branches in addition to his housekeeping branches. These included Foreign Liaison, Military Attaché, Psychological Warfare, Prisoner of War, and Geographic branches. The latter was announced 25th of November 1942 as the coordinating and policy-making agency for War Department procurement, preparation, and reproduction of maps. The Assistant Chief Military Intelligence Service, Security, the old Counterintelligence Group, retained the same essential organization, being divided into Domestic Intelligence, Counterintelligence, and Safeguarding Military Information, or Special. Not shown on the chart was the Special Branch, which handled all matters relating to cryptographic security and communications, interception and analysis of cryptographic and coded messages, and measures relating to the use and security of radar and signal intelligence. This branch reported directly to the Assistant Chief of Staff, G2, because the nature of its activities prevented a wholesale circulation of its efforts." End quote. The Evaluation Board, established on November 3, 1942, in accordance with General Strong's particular wishes, was directly responsible to the Assistant Chief of Staff, G2, and the Chief of the Military Intelligence Service. It maintained close liaison with both the North American and Foreign Intelligence Command and the American Intelligence Command. In addition, foreign country experts were added to its membership, indicating increasing importance for country specialists. Quote, General Strong next proceeded to announce a new organization which more closely met his demands for an intelligence division. Although he disapproved of a separate military intelligence service, he retained it and attempted to fashion his organization to produce the desired effect. The new organization was announced 25th of January 1943. The General Staff section was divided into a policy section charged with the study and review of policies and their coordination in the General Staff and War Department. The remainder of the staff was transferred to the evaluation and dissemination staff of the intelligence group. This staff was charged with evaluation, interpretation, dissemination, and planning of intelligence. Specifically, it was charged with the determination of the intelligence requirements of the Chief of Staff and Operations Division. Current intelligence production and planning were, therefore, taken out of the hands of the staff where General Strong apparently felt it never should have been placed. A policy group was left behind to study and coordinate policy matters. No mention is made of strategy and task force operations, but presumably these problems were discussed by the evaluation and dissemination staff. The mission of the staff had been stated even more fully on 8th of January 1943, when an interim organization was announced. It was to control policy on evaluation, supervise its execution in the several levels of the intelligence group, and give final and superior evaluation from the operations viewpoint to military information for the application of intelligence locally and for its dissemination wherever necessary. Thus, it not only set the policy for evaluation, but reviewed, in its supervisory capacity, the products of the various branches of the intelligence group. End quote. The four major units of the Military Intelligence Service, Administration, Intelligence, Counterintelligence, and Training, remained as they were, but new subdivision entities were created at the discretion of the heads of these offices. The North American and Foreign Intelligence Command was abolished at this time, and the American Intelligence Command became the American Intelligence Service, later the Latin American Unit. Quote, Further alterations in the structure of the organization were effected 3 months later. The Foreign Liaison and Prisoner of War branches were ordered to report directly to the Chief, Military Intelligence Service. The administrative group was abolished and its sections transferred to the executive. A chart of functions and personnel dated 17th of April 1943 reveals that the Chief, Military Intelligence Service, was also Deputy G2. 4 sections appear as part of the War Department General Staff G2: the Policy Section, the Evaluation and Dissemination Section, the Administrative Section, and the Joint Intelligence Committee Section. At the same time, an Evaluation and Dissemination Staff is included in the structure of the intelligence group. A study of its functions and personnel reveals an interesting situation. As a part of the G2 General Staff, the Evaluation and Dissemination Section's functions are listed first as those assigned to the Evaluation and Dissemination Staff, and then as a section to study, quote, physical, economic, political, and ethnological geography in order to advise on measures of national security and assist in assuring continued peace in the post-war world, and conducted studies of a broad nature to assist in the prosecution of the war. End quote. Its other functions were to advise the Chief Intelligence Group on the intelligence requirements of the Military Intelligence Division's customers and to assign priority to their requests. They would also evaluate and synthesize information and intelligence produced and make sure that there was always careful and complete consideration of all information in the Military Intelligence Service. Finally, they were to review and give final evaluation of intelligence before it was disseminated, and exercise general supervision over Military Intelligence Service publications and reports. Now, the first function quoted above is exactly the same, except for slight changes in verbiage, as the mission of the geopolitical branch as stated in June 1942. Nowhere else in the chart is there a reference to the branch, nor had there ever been any mention of it on any chart because of a desire to keep its activities secret. In February or March, the branch's title had been changed to the less alarming Analysis Branch." End quote. Next came renewed efforts to abolish the Military Intelligence Service and Central Intelligence Operations under a new organization. Quote, "On 30th of August, 1943, it was announced that General Hayes Kroner, then Chief Military Intelligence Service, would become Deputy for Administration, G2. Colonel Thomas J. Betts was announced as Deputy for Intelligence, G2. No new chief was announced for the Military Intelligence Service. All of the old agencies of the Military Intelligence Division and the Military Intelligence Service were grouped under these two deputies. This was done in recognition of the fact that all G2 Military Intelligence Service activities, regardless of allocation, are concerned fundamentally with military intelligence and security. It was further provided that an intelligence-producing agency stripped of all administrative and operational functions should be established. All other functions were to be handled by another agency. Thus, two deputies were established, the one responsible for administrative and other functions, while the other was responsible for intelligence." End quote. A second stage of the MIS abolition plan came on September 22, 1943, in a memorandum announcing a further reorganization around three deputies, one for administration, one for air, and one for intelligence. The first of these remained with General Kroner, who was also given responsibility for the operation of the services group, the training group, and the historical branch. Quote, "The mission of the Deputy for Intelligence was defined in the same terms as in the previous memorandum. He was to direct not only the Policy and Strategy Group and Theater Group, but also the Collection Group, the Prisoner of War Branch, and the Order of Battle Branch. Thus, the function of collection was returned to the Deputy for Intelligence. The Deputy for Air was made responsible for the re-established Air Unit, which was charged with the same liaison function formerly assigned to the Air Liaison Section. The Deputy for Air was also charged with the supervision of Air Corps personnel assigned to G2 and who were to be integrated into the various sections of the theater group. Their functions were not elaborated, but they presumably remained the same as before. The new organization was not, in point of fact, so new as it appeared to be. The memorandum had merely recalled the earlier one by General Strong protesting the creation of MIS, and then accomplished the same purpose. The primary difference was the return of the collection function to the intelligence group. It represents General Strong's ideal organization of an intelligence agency. He believed the separation of the Military Intelligence Service from the Military Intelligence Division had been unfortunate. Therefore, it was abolished. He believed the organization should rest on functional basis. Therefore, intelligence planning and policy, screening and evaluation, and dissemination were brought together under one roof. The many miscellaneous functions of G2, services, training, mapping, history, etc., were left outside the key organization. In a sense, the Military Intelligence Service had become the organization of the Deputy for Intelligence, except that policy and planning was not left in the intelligence-producing agency. Paradoxically, the organization charts of the War Department and the Army continued to show a separate military intelligence service, although it had been abolished. The bulk of the personnel allotted to the Military Intelligence Division were allotted to a military intelligence service. Many papers prepared in G2 continued to carry signatures indicating that the Military Intelligence Service existed and functioned. This situation was deliberate. The reorganization memorandum stressed the fact that its details were to be retained in the Military Intelligence Division. Outside the division, an effort was made to maintain the appearance of a separate military intelligence service." End quote. When General Strong's tenure at G2 came to an end, and on February 7, 1944, he was replaced by Major General Clayton Bissell, the reinstatement of MIS, in accordance with the Chief of Staff's original wishes, was assured. Quote, "The preliminary study for another reorganization was already in progress. 3 days after General Strong was relieved as Assistant Chief of Staff, G2, the Adjutant General issued a letter order establishing 2 boards of officers to study, recommend, and supervise the reorganization of the Military Intelligence Division. The first board consisted of Brigadier General Elliott D. Cook, the steering member, Colonel John H. Stutzman, Lieutenant Colonel Francis H. Brigham, Jr., Captain Jerome Hubbard, and Mr. George Schwartzwalder, Bureau of the Budget. This board was directed to make a detailed study and to submit recommendations for the reorganization of the Military Intelligence Division. They were further ordered to supervise the implementation of these recommendations under the supervision of a second board. It consisted of John J. McCloy, Assistant Secretary of War, Major General John P. Smith, Major General Clayton L. Bissell, and Brigadier General Otto L. Nelson, Jr. They were directed to consider, approve, and supervise the implementation of the recommendations submitted by the Cook Committee." End quote. The work of these 2 panels came to a conclusion within 2 months from their creation. Quote, "On 23 March 1944, Mr. McCloy reported to the Chief of Staff the proposals of his committee, based upon the study of the Cook Committee. A revision of AR 10-15 was suggested, which would give to the Military Intelligence Service the responsibility of securing pertinent information and converting it into intelligence for the use of the Chief of Staff, the General Staff, and the Military Intelligence Service. The policy staff would state and carry out all policies concerning intelligence and counterintelligence within the Army. The G2 was responsible for the interior security of the Army and the production of intelligence necessary for the operation of the War Department. The purpose of the proposed change was clear. It not only separated the Military Intelligence Service from the policy staff and delineated the responsibilities of each, but it also clarified the relationship between the division and the service. This recommended revision was not adopted. McCloy next outlined the proposed reorganization of G2. It emphasized the fact that the policy staff must not be merged or integrated with the Military Intelligence Service. The work of the policy staff was divided into 4 groups of related subjects. A later regrouping and rephrasing of these subjects integrated and reduced the number of functions. The aim of both allocations was to enable a small body of experts to prepare policies, each in his particular specialty. The broad outlines of the Military Intelligence Service were likewise sketched, but it was emphasized that within the organization, rigid compartmentalization would be avoided. The Chief Military Intelligence Service was charged with 2 responsibilities: the collection of information from all sources and the production of intelligence. The Director of Information was to discharge the first function, assisted by a Supervisor of Information, gathering personnel, liaison groups, etc., and a supervisor for receiving, classifying, and distributing information. The Director of Intelligence would be assisted by an editorial group, intelligence specialists, and a Chief of Research. Finally, an Executive for Administration was to be created to relieve the Chief Military Intelligence Service and his 2 Directors of Administrative Problems. He was not to be a channel of communication between the directors and the Chief of the Military Intelligence Service." End quote. Ultimately, there came the implementation of the proposals of the Cook-McCloy panels. Quote, "The Reorganization Committee had recommended that AR 10-15 be revised so that the distinctions between the Military Intelligence Division and the Military Intelligence Service would be properly stated and made clear for all. This recommendation was not accepted. In September, however, a General Staff Circular 5-2, 27th of September 1944, was issued, which superseded the regulation and achieved the desired end. It carefully listed the responsibilities and functions of the Military Intelligence Division and its subdivisions. The responsibility of the Assistant Chief of Staff, G2, was defined as the preparation of plans and policies concerning military intelligence and counterintelligence. The functions of the division were listed, and it was made plain that it was to formulate plans and policies and to supervise the execution of the 11 functions listed. The circular was prepared by the policy staff, and there was, therefore, no confusion of language between information and intelligence. One factor, however, was added which had not been made explicit before. This was the supervisory responsibility of the division. The list of functions is clear and speaks for itself. It is therefore quoted in full. Quote, "The Military Intelligence Division formulates plans and policies and supervises 1. Collection of information and intelligence at home and abroad, to include interrogation of prisoners of war. 2. Evaluation and interpretation of information and intelligence. 3. Dissemination of intelligence. 4. Terrain intelligence, including coordination of producing agencies. 5. Intelligence and counterintelligence training. 6. Military liaison with representatives of foreign governments. 7. Safeguarding military information, to include censorship and communications security. 8. Counterintelligence measures, to include evasion and escape. 9. Army participation in propaganda and psychological warfare. 10. Army historical activities. And 11. The Military Intelligence Service, which is charged with appropriate operational functions concerning matters within the purview of the Military Intelligence Division." End quote. For the first time, then, the distinction between the Military Intelligence Division and the Military Intelligence Service was clearly stated. It made a fact of the efforts of the last few years to make the Military Intelligence Service the operational agency and the Military Intelligence Division the policy and planning agency. The normal staff duty of supervision was assigned to the Military Intelligence Division. No less important was the fact that the circular provided the division with an up-to-date statement of its mission, responsibilities, and functions. In effect, it was the statement of functions described in the report of the Reorganization Committee. Before leaving the evolution of the Military Intelligence Division, brief attention should be given to its operational units and their general activities. The first consideration in this regard is the intelligence collection function. Quote, "As of 7th of December 1941, the collection of intelligence information was the responsibility of the intelligence branch of the Military Intelligence Division. This branch also evaluated and distributed intelligence information, maintained digests of information of foreign countries, prepared combat, political, and economic estimates, and prepared special studies on foreign countries. Its geographical subsections directed and coordinated the collection of information by military attachés by means of index guide and direct communication. The index guide was a broad general outline covering the various aspects of information to be reported on a foreign country. It was too general to be considered an intelligence directive from which timely intelligence information could be expected. Specific direction to the military attachés in regard to collecting intelligence information was spasmodic and therefore incomplete. The geographic sections tended to depend on the ingenuity and clairvoyance of the military attaché to forward desired information. The first step toward centralization came in March 1942, when a collection section was established in the Situation and Planning branch of the intelligence group. Although the primary function of collecting information remained with the geographic and subsections of the intelligence group, the collection section maintained liaison with other government agencies to secure information. It was essentially a liaison section until in November, when the collection branch was placed in the dissemination group. Its new directive made it the agency to receive and requisition all information except routine emanating from the field services. It obtained special information for the geographic branches and other divisions of the Military Intelligence Service, and from time to time it issued such intelligence directives as the chief of the intelligence group might direct. The emphasis here was on non-routine reports. Routine reports were still the responsibility of the geographic branches. In securing its information, the branch used personal interviews, maintained contact with governmental and civilian agencies, and contacted field representatives. End quote. Field intelligence was gathered for battle commanders and strategists with a view to its immediate use by them and then subsequent forwarding to the Military Intelligence Division. Footnote: on the collection of field intelligence for immediate combat purposes, see Robert R. Glass and Philip P. Davidson. Intelligence is for Commanders. Harrisburg, Military Service Publishing Company, 1948. Also see Oscar W. Koch with Robert G. Hayes, G2, Intelligence for Patton, Philadelphia, Whitmore Publishing Company, 1971. End footnote. The intelligence needs of the General Staff in Washington were dictated by global strategy. Commanders closer to specific operations required detailed intelligence of a more particularistic type. In many ways, MID sought to collect and maintain information which would serve both levels of intelligence need. Quote, the functions of the collection branch were redefined 29th of January 1943 by the Chief Intelligence Group after the reorganization outlined in Memorandum Number 18. The branch was designated as the agency to requisition, receive, and allocate all material coming into the intelligence group. Nevertheless, the individual units of the group could still correspond with the Military Intelligence Service field representatives in the area of the special interest, but henceforth were required to keep the chief of the collection branch informed of this correspondence. A system of weekly reports to the collection branch were inaugurated, which itemized the types of information desired, assigned a priority rating, and distinguished new from old or repeated requests. These reports helped the branch coordinate collection activities with the requirements of other agencies. It did not yet have complete control over the collection of information, but a procedure by which a large portion of the requests were cleared through the branch was established. The responsibility for liaison and the development of new sources increased the degree of its control over the collection of information. On 18th of March 1943, the Foreign Branch, actually the Field Services Branch at this period, was transferred to the Collection Branch. By this transfer, the collection unit gained administrative control of the military attaché system. On 2nd of April 1943, the organization of the unit was described and its functions redefined. No new functions were added except those acquired through the incorporation of the Foreign Liaison Branch, but the overall statement of responsibility designated the unit as the agency to requisition, receive, and allocate all material coming into the intelligence group. The regional branches were still authorized to communicate directly with our representatives abroad. End quote. Next came the reorganization of 1944 and its effects upon the collection of intelligence information. Quote, the reorganization plan of the McCloy Committee recognized the importance of the collection of information to the production of intelligence. An agency, separate from the research branches, was created to exploit all possible sources and to collect timely, useful information. The production of information, the raw material of intelligence, was placed under the Director of Information, and more specifically in the Source Control Unit. The supervisor of source control processed, trained, and assigned information gathering personnel. It advised them of the types of information required. It assured the timely receipt of useful information. It weeded out useless information and developed new sources. As established, it was largely an administrative and supervisory office, but it soon acquired other functions. In October 1944, a War Department Intelligence Collection Committee was established under the Supervisor of Source Control. It was formed to coordinate and integrate all War Department intelligence target objectives for the exploitation in Germany and other rehabilitated areas formerly occupied by the Axis. The committee coordinated and compiled the requirements of the research branches of the Military Intelligence Service, the Technical Services, and the Air Forces into target objective folders. The folders were sent overseas to the Combined Intelligence Objectives Subcommittee, which coordinated all Allied intelligence requirements so as to prevent duplication of investigation and to promote the most efficient use of specialist personnel. The committee also sent out investigative teams from the United States to exploit intelligence targets. In November 1944, the committee began to turn its attention to objectives in Japan and Japanese-occupied territory. The first of these folders was dispatched in May 1945. The formal charter of the committee was not issued until June 9, 1945, but it had already been in operation for some time before this. Its secretariat was created September 23, 1944, to do the actual writing and coordinating of intelligence requests. The Secretariat worked under the supervision of the Supervisor of Source Control, who had been performing this work. Reports from the theaters were received in the reading panel, which determined the reproduction and distribution to be given all incoming material. The Secretariat filed new information in the target objective folders as received. Documents of basic Army interest were sent to the Pacific Military Intelligence Research Section, Camp Ritchie, Maryland, and those of basic Navy interest were sent to the Navy Document Center. Both agencies maintained accession lists of documents received." End quote. This committee marked an important pinnacle in centralized coordination of intelligence information collection. To further facilitate this organizational system, a monitoring control procedure for processing information requests was created. This practice allowed the Supervisor of Source Control to assign requests to the appropriate unit responsible for developing the type of information desired, to supervise response time and quality, and to otherwise remain apprised of the status of such inquiries. The Source Control Unit continued to issue general directives as well regarding the collection of information, thereby setting priorities and establishing a degree of quality control as well." End quote. Another important entity within MID was the military attaché structure. Quote, "The group which administered this system during the war changed its name from time to time. It was known as the Military Attaché Section and Branch until April 17, 1943, and thereafter as the Foreign Branch. The function and mission of the organization remained about the same throughout the period. The relation of the branch to the military attaché system was purely administrative. It processed personnel assigned to these offices. It brought them to the Military Intelligence Division, where passports were arranged, inoculations procured, and intelligence indoctrination was completed. Thereafter, the branch handled all administrative correspondence between them and the War Department and supervised the administration of their offices. Finally, it was responsible for assisting the collection of intelligence by transmitting specific requests and general directives, such as the Index Guide. In December of 1941, the section was composed of 6 officers and 9 civilians under the direction of Captain, later Colonel, W. M. Adams. In the field, there were 52 offices, staffed by 129 officers. Coincident with the reorganization of the War Department, March 9, 1942, an air section, made up of an increment of officers from the Foreign Liaison Section A2, was added to administer the air attaché system. In early 1942, there were 12 assistant military attachés for air, each with an airplane and a crew chief. By December 1, 1945, this number had grown to include 48 military air attachés and assistants in 38 military attaché offices abroad." End quote. Another mechanism developed for coordinated intelligence collection was the Joint Intelligence Collection Agencies. Quote, after the North African invasion, it was found that in areas where a theater commander was actually present, the flow of intelligence stopped. The theater intelligence organizations were interested in combat intelligence rather than intelligence and information necessary for training and strategic planning. The solution was the formation of the Joint Intelligence Collection Agency in North Africa, Algiers, by an agreement with General Eisenhower, dated January 26, 1943. This agency was expanded on May 30, 1943, to include not just Algiers, but all of North Africa, and became known as the Joint Intelligence Collection Agency North Africa. A second Joint Intelligence Collection Agency was established as Joint Intelligence Collection Agency Middle East for the Middle East Theater, April 23, 1943. On August 5, 1943, the system was placed on a worldwide basis by direction of the Joint Deputy Chiefs of Staff. The third was established in the China-Burma-India Theater, August 19, 1943, and from this, a separate one was established for China, April 27, 1945, when that theater was established. The Pacific Ocean area was served by the Joint Intelligence Collection, Pacific Ocean Area, which was operated under the direction of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. End quote. Footnote. For a view of coordinated intelligence operations within General Eisenhower's Supreme Headquarters in London, see Kenneth Strong, Intelligence at the Top, New York Doubleday and Company, 1969, pages 72 through 299. End footnote. In addition to supplying administrative support and guidance for the Joint Intelligence Collection Agencies, the Foreign Branch of the MID Collection Unit also supervised two special missions. Organized in the summer of 1943, the first of these entities gathered all information available regarding the latest developments and capabilities of the enemy in the field of bacteriological warfare. The second, called the ALSOS mission, was operational by the autumn. It sought scientists and scientific information which might reveal the progress of the enemy in atomic research and allied subjects. As of June 1944, liaison between MID and other federal agencies was centralized in a Washington liaison branch, but even after that time, informal liaison persisted beyond the new unit's control. Quote, the roots of the branch are to be found in the contact section, existing in the intelligence branch on December 5, 1941. It was charged with contacting State, Office of Naval Intelligence, etc., for military information. Subsequent charts and reorganization memoranda do not mention it, but a chart of May 15, 1942, lists one of the functions in the dissemination branch as interviewing returning observers, a task later assigned to the Washington liaison branch. Mention of a contact and liaison section is made October 23, 1942, in a discussion of intelligence possibilities in the interviews of returning observers, officers, and civilians by Major Edward F. Smith in October and November 1942. As we have seen in the discussion of the collection branch, this function was included in the directive of December 9, 1942. Nevertheless, there seems to have been at least 3 agencies doing this type of work independently and without coordination: War Department Liaison, State Department Liaison, and Domestic Branch, all in the collection unit. In February 1944, there were 150 liaison functions performed in Military Intelligence Division, but they were not coordinated or controlled. Many offices whose functions were normally liaison acted independently of their superiors and on their own initiative. As Colonel H. H. Mole, chief of the North American branch, said, there were too many people running too many contacts for successful work. End quote. While the coordination of liaison was a persistent and continuous problem in Washington for MID, it was less so in field contacts with private business enterprises, due largely to the good efforts of regional offices. Quote, at one time there were 4 such offices in New York, San Francisco, Miami, and New Orleans. They were established to collect information of intelligence value to the War Department from sources peculiar to their location. In addition, they performed such functions as liaison with foreign personnel, dictated by the characteristics of the industries and traffic of their locations. Only the Miami office survived the war, all of the rest having been closed before the end of hostilities. The branch offices originated in 1940. At that time, most of the information coming into the division came in the form of military attaché reports. It was recognized that there was a considerable amount of information to be had in the principal ports of entry and in the metropolitan centers of the nation. Files of trade data, insurance maps, and related data, records of financial transactions, engineering reports, travel diaries, and field notes of scientists, and other similar items existed in these centers. This material could not be shipped to Washington for processing, so that it was necessary to go to the sources." End quote. The first such field office to be established by MID was in New York. Opened on July 8, 1940, it initially concentrated on Latin American intelligence, but by August 1941, the product had shifted to target folders on Europe and subsequently on Japan. Before being closed on December 31, 1944, a satellite of the New York office was opened in Chicago sometime between January and March of 1943. A New Orleans unit operated between April 17, 1941 and February 2, 1943. The San Francisco office was inaugurated on July 31, 1941, and initially devoted its attention to interviewing evacuees from the Asiatic and Pacific areas of conflict. Later, the intelligence interest of the unit shifted to business and educational sources familiar with the Orient. While in operation, the office cooperated closely with representatives of the Office of Naval Intelligence. It ceased functioning on June 30, 1944. The Miami office was the longest-lived and last to open, commencing operations on April 7, 1942. Its principal focus was upon Latin and South American developments and the trafficking of foreign visitors to the United States via the Miami Gateway. Quote, "The Foreign Liaison Office was created 31st of August 1941 to facilitate the work of foreign military attachés and other foreign officers in this country on official business. It made arrangements to see that proper courtesies were extended to them and systematized and controlled the military information furnished them. At the beginning of the war, it was a part of the administrative branch. In March of 1942, it was directly under the Executive, Military Intelligence Service, but later was placed under the G2. In March, it consisted of 12 officers and 24 civilians, but the same month received an increment of personnel from the Foreign Liaison Section of the Air Staff. After the reorganization of June 1944, it was placed in the Washington Liaison Branch, where it remained for the rest of the war. Throughout the war, then, it was concerned with the problem of satisfying the needs of the diplomatic military representatives of foreign governments. The basic directives and decisions which related to the release and exchange of both technical and military information were made outside of the section. The results of these decisions flowed through it. The policies adopted in regard to the exchange of information and intelligence with the British and our other allies were developed on a higher level than the Military Intelligence Division, but it took part in the discussions. Once the general policy was adopted, there then remained the task of implementing it and working out the details on the working levels. In general, this was done not in broad general agreements, but in a series of specific arrangements, sometimes verbal and informal. The background of these agreements lies in the pre-war period when the military staffs of the two nations met to discuss plans for strategy and to prepare for eventualities. Beginning in January 1941, staff conversations were held to this end. Throughout, the American representatives were careful not to commit the nation to a line of action which might later prove embarrassing. Agreements were made and conversations held not on the basis of when the United States entered the war, but if it should be forced to enter it. After 7th of December 1941, further conversations and meetings were held, and more definite agreements were made." End quote. One of the devices developed to facilitate cooperative intelligence arrangements between the United States and Great Britain was a special panel called the Combined Intelligence Committee. It was part of a progression of intelligence coordinating units created during the war. First, a Joint Army and Navy Intelligence Committee was created under the Joint Army and Navy Board on December 3, 1941. Organized in 1903, the Joint Board made recommendations to the Secretaries of War and Navy on matters involving cooperation of the two armed services. Its subordinate agencies included the Joint Planning Committee, established in 1919, the Joint Economy Board, established in 1933, and the Intelligence Unit. The Joint Board was abolished in 1947 with the institution of the Department of Defense. Next came the Joint Intelligence Committee, organized under the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Quote, "This committee, known also as JIC, was a continuation and enlargement of the Joint Board Committee of the same name, which had been authorized in 1941. It received no charter from the Joint Chiefs of Staff until May 1943, but it was given a directive and was reorganized early in March 1942. Even before this, on February 11, 1942, a combined Chiefs of Staff paper had defined the duties and membership of the Joint Intelligence Committee. Its primary functions throughout the war period were to furnish intelligence in various forms to other agencies of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and to represent it on the Combined Intelligence Committee. As originally constituted, the Joint Intelligence Committee was composed of the directors of the intelligence services of the Army and Navy and representatives of the State Department, the Board of Economic Warfare, later the Foreign Economic Administration, and the Coordinator of Information, later the Director of Strategic Services. The Charter of May 1943 added the Director of the Intelligence Staff of the Army Air Forces. This membership remained unchanged throughout the remainder of the war. The Joint Intelligence Committee was assisted by a full-time subcommittee and some 10 or more special subcommittees. The permanent working staff was organized by the committee early in 1942 as the Joint Intelligence Subcommittee, JISC. Its status was formalized in the charter of the committee on May 1943. 2 months later, the Joint Intelligence Subcommittee was renamed the Joint Intelligence Staff, JIS. The latter agency was given a charter by the Joint Chiefs of Staff in May 1944 and operated under it throughout the remainder of the war." End quote. Footnote: General Services Administration, National Archives and Record Service, the National Archives, Federal Records of World War II, Military Agencies, Volume 2, Washington, U.S. Government Print Office, 1951, page 9. End footnote. Then came the Combined Intelligence Committee. Quote, "Provision for this committee, known also as CIC, was made in the agreement to create the Combined Chiefs of Staff, but it does not appear to have met before May 1942. Its working subcommittee, however, known first as the Combined Intelligence Subcommittee, CISC, and from August 1943 as the Combined Intelligence Staff, CIS, met as early as February 19, 1942. This subcommittee was composed of the Joint Intelligence Subcommittee, later the Joint Intelligence Staff, and the British Joint Intelligence Committee in Washington. The Combined Intelligence Committee consisted of the Joint Intelligence Committee and representatives of the British Joint Intelligence Subcommittee in London. Both the Combined Intelligence Committee and the Combined Intelligence Staff continued throughout the war. The former was responsible for collecting and disseminating military intelligence for the use of the Combined Chiefs of Staff and the Combined Staff Planners." End quote. Other units of the Military Intelligence Division with specialized intelligence collection functions included a prisoner interrogation group. Quote, "The Captured Personnel and Material Branch was originally known as the Prisoner of War Branch. It was not established until 22nd of October 1942, although one of its functions, the Interrogation Center, had been established a few months earlier. Thus, the origins of the branch go back almost to the beginning of the war. The original impetus for the establishment of the interrogation centers came from the Navy. The Office of Naval Intelligence had studied an interrogation center near London during the period from 25th of June to 17th of December 1941. It found that such a center, where selected prisoners were interrogated, offered many advantages over a system of interrogation which stopped with the initial questionings at the time of the capture. The Navy and War Departments had agreed that the Army would be responsible for all captured personnel, and that the Navy would turn them over to the Army as soon as possible after capture. Upon completion of the study, the Secretary of the Navy recommended the idea to the Secretary of War. After study by the Military Intelligence Division, the plan was agreed to. It was agreed that 2 interrogation centers would be established, one in the east near Washington and the other in California. On 15th of May, 1942, Fort Hunt, Virginia, was selected as the East Coast Center, and construction was completed by the end of July. End quote. Activated in April 1942, the Fort Hunt Interrogation Center was allotted 68 officers and 61 enlisted men. In September of the following year, these personnel were reduced to 41 officers and 61 enlisted men. The West Coast Center, opened at the end of December 1942, was located at Byron Hot Spring, but had a mailing address of Tracy, California, thereby causing it to be geographically referred to by 2 different names. Quote, "The interrogation centers, Fort Hunt and Tracy, were subject to a dual command. They were under the control of the Provost Marshal General, who designated the commanding officers for the 2 camps. These officers were responsible for procurement of equipment and overhead personnel upon requisition from the Corps areas. Interrogation personnel were supplied by the Military Intelligence Division and the Office of Naval Intelligence, and their activities coordinated by the senior interrogating officer. The camps were classified as temporary detention centers. Within the compound of the camps, the area known as the Interrogation Center was operated by and was the responsibility of the Chief of the Military Intelligence Service. This arrangement was not satisfactory. G2 requested a unified control be established as more efficient and conducive to improved morale. The request was disapproved as contrary to existing regulations. The Adjutant General was then asked to establish a new regulation similar to that governing the harbor defenses. This was accomplished on 14th of April 1943 when the post commanders of Fort Hunt and Byron Hot Springs were ordered reassigned. This marked the end of the dual control system and the transfer of these operations to the Chief Military Intelligence Service. The senior interrogating officer was thereafter post commander. End quote. The last of the intelligence collection units of MID was the Map and Photograph Branch, which began as the geographic section of the Plans and Training Branch in 1941 before reorganization into a separate branch in the spring of the next year. Subunits included a photo section, still picture section, enemy motion picture film, military technical photography, photographic division, processing, terrain photo section, military technical photo unit, indexing and filing, and motion picture unit. There was, of course, close liaison with the Army Map Service and Army Pictorial Service. Materials were also drawn from the Aeronautical Chart Service, Navy Hydrographic Office, Coast and Geodetic Survey, U.S. Geological Survey, Office of Strategic Services, and several commercial firms, including the National Geographic Society. Quote, "Generally speaking, the division followed a traditionally geographic approach to the problem of intelligence production. There were those who found that the functional divisions of the McCloy Committee were sound. In certain specialized subjects, as order of battle, air, and topographical intelligence, a functional grouping was more desirable. Shortly after the war, the division again embraced the geographic arrangement, which would seem to settle the matter, at least for the moment, but a post-war opinion of wartime operations states that the division was not operating efficiently until the end of 1944, by which time the geographical arrangement had been abandoned. End quote. Whichever approach was operative in intelligence production, the core element of the research sections was their filing systems. According to the Basic Intelligence Directive, numbers and subjects served to indicate the most probable subdivisions into which information might be placed. Quote, intelligence was produced by other means than merely filing incoming reports. Careful studies were made from minutiae collected from the files of business concerns. Thus, a laborious study of the organization and production techniques used in the manufacture of an essential item might point out those places where the disruption of a simple process would halt production with only a modest expenditure of bombs. Thus, manufacturing, processing, and transportation bottlenecks were sought as targets. Captured orders were examined to discover the formation of new types of outfits for clues to future plans. The Who's Who files were especially useful in turning up new and special type organizations. All available information on the enemy was studied because eventually it was grist for the mill. End quote. Under the geographic arrangement, the principal research units were British Empire, Western Europe, Central Europe, Eastern Europe, the Far East, and Latin America. This 1941 structure gave way the following year to the Euro-African, Far Eastern, and American Intelligence Service Groups, the Air Unit, and Special Branch, the last named being the largest intelligence-producing agency in MID at the time. The 1944 reorganization saw the establishment of the military, topographic, political, economic, sociological, scientific, and Who's Who branches. But this scenario, too, was due for alteration. Quote, under the terms of the reorganization of June 1944, political and economic intelligence was to be produced by two branches devoted to these subjects and working on a worldwide basis. To this end, they were separated, and personnel and equipment were brought in from the geographic branches and the special branch. In November, the Far Eastern section of the political branch was separated and transferred to the economic branch, and the European functions of the economic branch were transferred to the political branch. Each became, in fact, a political economic branch, responsible for the production of intelligence on these matters according to a geographic area. The old political branch being responsible for Europe, Latin America, and North America, and the economic branch being responsible for the Far East. End quote. The personalities of leaders and organized groups opposed to the Allies' cause were of interest to the War Department, and this prompted the collection of intelligence material pertaining to such individuals. Quote, originally, this information had been filed in the records section by relatively unskilled clerks who composed and filed the cross-reference sheets. Later, this function was removed from the records section, and in January 1943, counterintelligence was removed from the Military Intelligence Division and decentralized to the service commands under the direction of the Army Service Forces. It was necessary then to find a substitute whereby central files could be established for the recording of biographical information needed in the Military Intelligence Division. It should also be borne in mind that the information which was secured by the counterintelligence group had been concerned largely with subversive personnel, and thus left out a large segment of the world's population who did not fall automatically into this category. The geographical branches had maintained files of persons of interest to them in their particular area, but these files were, of course, decentralized and suffered from the limitations of decentralization. Persons shifting from area to area could not easily be followed then, unless proper inquiries were made between the geographic branches. In January 1943, the special branch began a name file of persons or persons of interest to it, and since it was not bound by geographical limitations, a nucleus of a central file was established with trained personnel to operate it." End quote. In June 1944, the Who's Who branch became the recipient of name file of the Special Branch and received as well the relevant personality files of the geographical branches. Quote, "An offshoot of the geographic section of the Plans and Training Branch, later Map and Photo Branch, was the Topographic Branch, which was formed in June 1944 by separating the Map Service, Photo Intelligence, and Interpretation Reports sections from the remainder to form the Map and Photo Branch. That which remained became the Terrain, previously the Geographic Research section, the Cartographic section, and the Transportation section. As a result, it became more of a research section. The intelligence which it produced was provided not only to the War Department General Staff, but also to such agencies as the Joint Intelligence Committee, the Joint War Plans Committee, and the Joint Logistics Plan Committee. It produced intelligence concerning terrain, vegetation, routes of movements, and drainage, but also supplied intelligence concerning landing beaches, climate, and soil trafficability, which was generally produced by other agencies. The chief of the branch represented the Military Intelligence Division on the Joint Intelligence Committee to obtain topographic intelligence. He also represented the War Department General Staff on the United States Board on Geographical Names. The Terrain section procured, selected, evaluated, and integrated information concerning terrain and climate. It also prepared written reports and manuscript maps which interpreted terrain and climate intelligence. The Transportation section was a new function, or a specialization, which appeared after the reorganization. It was designed to handle the demand for information and intelligence concerning the classifications and locations of rail networks and terminals, roads, trains, bridges, and tunnels, and the depths, widths, and currents of navigable rivers. It also prepared manuscript maps, as directed, of transportation networks. By VJ Day, this objective was only partially satisfied. The following sections of the Far East were completed: Burma, China proper, Netherlands Indies, Indochina, Malaya, and Thailand, with Formosa, Japan, Korea, Manchuria, and the Philippines partially completed. The cartographic section produced maps and graphic material required by the other sections to present topographic intelligence in its final form." End quote. The scientific branch maintained liaison with federal agencies in an effort to keep abreast of the latest developments in American and Allied war research, and also sought to produce intelligence regarding enemy progress in such diverse subjects as radar and related electronic matters, rocketry, jet propulsion, atomic energy production, and conventional weapons improvements. Its subunits consisted of a chemical and biological warfare section, electronics section, new weapons section, and subsequently a physics section. Quote, "The sociological branch was a new agency in the military intelligence service, but its work had been foreshadowed in the activities of other branches. Under the new functional organization, most of these dispersed activities were combined and enlarged, and coordinated effort provided. The geographic branches had done some of the work which the new branch would perform, as well as the propaganda branch, which had attempted some surveys of morale and propaganda, which duplicated the later work of the branch. The geopolitical branch had undertaken some population studies during its brief existence, and these were now taken over by the sociological branch. The main effort of the branch was directed toward the discovery of sociological trends of military importance. Population and manpower data was studied for clues to vital statistics, as well as the migrations and occupational characteristics of groups and types. Manpower and labor problems were studied to discover the availability of manpower for military and industrial service, and the effect of legislation and organizations on the availability of manpower. Both civilian and military morale was studied in enemy countries. Social groups and classes were studied to discover how their cleavages and tensions might be used to serve military ends." End quote. Organized in June 1944, the military branch produced intelligence on all aspects of foreign ground and air forces, with an emphasis upon order of battle data, but included as well weapons, fortifications, air industry, and some translation activities assigned to the unit. The functions of the branch were not new, but had appeared during the war and had suffered ineffective execution due to dispersed administration and treatment. Quote, "At the top of the pyramid of intelligence production personnel were the specialists. While the rest of the division was organized functionally in 1944, the specialists were organized geographically. In theory, they drew upon the resources of the other branches for the types of information which they required. To the material received from the research sections, they gave the final evaluation and approval before it was disseminated, thus inheriting some of the functions of the evaluation staff. By means of the G2's morning conference, they presented the latest information from all corners of the world with their evaluation of its meaning and importance. Thereafter, during the day, they sent him such other reports as were required. They worked with the Director of Intelligence and assisted him in giving directives to the Supervisor of Source Control to gather information which they required, and gave direction and supervision to the research sections for the same purpose." End quote. This, then, generally describes the MID intelligence production organization. But once intelligence information had been collected, analyzed, and a product was produced, one general function remained to be served: dissemination. Quote, "Throughout the war, there were efforts to centralize the dissemination of intelligence. Prior to 1944, the dissemination unit had achieved the greatest degree of centralization so far attained. At no time, however, did it or the reports unit establish complete control of all phases of this activity. Indeed, this would have been impossible. Dissemination included not only the preparation of printed periodical publications of intelligence, but also the means by which intelligence was presented to the G2, the Chief of Staff, and the various staff divisions. Intelligence was disseminated by periodic publications, special reports, conferences, and so on. Besides the usual types of reports and memoranda, maps, photographs, charts, and tables were used to present the material at hand. The normal dissemination functions were the responsibility of the dissemination unit in early 1944. Its antecedents include the dissemination section of the intelligence branch, which became the dissemination branch in April 1942. Meanwhile, the situation branch, created early in 1942, was performing dissemination functions. In August 1942, the evaluation and dissemination branch was created to include the work of the dissemination and situation branches in the dissemination section, along with other sections devoted to communications, theater intelligence, and order of battle. A project and review board reviewed all completed projects before they were sent out. In November 1942, the designation of these sections was changed to Dissemination Group under Colonel G.S. Smith. It included Cable Branch, Collection Branch, Theater Intelligence Branch, and Publications Branch. In April 1943, after a number of minor changes, the dissemination unit was created to be responsible for the format and appearance of any publication produced in the Military Intelligence Service. It also disseminated intelligence approved by the evaluation and dissemination staff. This last group had been established as the final evaluation and review authority for intelligence before it was disseminated to the Army. It passed on periodical items, monographs, studies, and similar reports." End quote. This was the pattern of reorganization and growth in the military intelligence establishment during World War II. Quote, "In 1941, G2 was a small organization. Under the impact of wartime expansion and development, it grew. In 1942, a new factor entered the picture in the form of a separate operating agency, and during the next 2 years, an effort was made to mold the organization into a single intelligence-producing and policy-making agency. In the course of these efforts, the Military Intelligence Service tended to lose its identity. In 1944, it reemerged as an intelligence operating and producing agency with definite functions and responsibilities. At the same time, there was a struggle over the best method of organizing to produce intelligence. Thus, evaluation was, for a time, turned over to a board which had as an additional function policymaking. In 1944, a new method was devised by which intelligence was produced by supervised specialists who were aided by the research groups. All of the policy-making activities were allocated to the Military Intelligence Division. But one fact must be borne in mind. This method was more easily devised in 1944 than at any previous time, because by then the Military Intelligence Division had lost its counterintelligence functions. Prior to that, the structure of the organization had included a provision for counterintelligence. With the loss of this function, it was possible to greatly simplify the organization and emphasize the importance of teamwork in the new Military Intelligence Division." End quote. While there was a War Department reorganization effective June 11, 1946, the Intelligence Division, G2, did much the same work as always. As with the other armed services, the next great revision of military intelligence functions and organization would occur in 1947 with the establishment of the Department of Defense, the National Security Council, and the Central Intelligence Agency. Two other outstanding units within the military intelligence network should be examined at this juncture: the Signal Corps' Cryptology Group and the Allied Intelligence Bureau. The great importance of the former of these entities derived, of course, from the successful decipherment of the Japanese code. Quote, "A trickle of magic in 1936 had become a stream in 1940. Credit for this belongs largely to Major General Joseph O. Mauborgne, who became Chief Signal Officer in October 1937. Mauborgne had long been interested in cryptology. In 1914, as a young first lieutenant, he achieved the first recorded solution of a cipher known as the Playfair, then used by the British as their field cipher. He described his technique in a 19-page pamphlet that was the first publication on cryptology issued by the United States government. In World War I, he put together several cryptographic elements to create the only theoretically unbreakable cipher, and promoted the first automatic cipher machine with which the unbreakable cipher was associated. When he became head of the Signal Corps, he immediately set about augmenting the important cryptanalytic activities. He established the SIS, Signal Intelligence Service, as an independent division reporting directly to him, enlarged its functions, set up branches, started correspondence courses, added intercept facilities, increased its budget, and put on more men. In 1939, when war broke out in Europe, SIS was the first agency in the War Department to receive more funds, personnel, and space. Perhaps most important of all, Mauborgne's intense interest inspired his men to outstanding accomplishments. More and more codes were broken, and as the international situation stimulated an increasing flow of intercepts, the magic intelligence approached flood stage." End quote. Footnote: David Kahn, The Codebreakers, New York, New American Library, 1973. Originally published 1967, page 7. End footnote. When Mauborgne retired in September 1941, being succeeded by Major General Dawson Olmsted, the cryptanalytic capability he had nurtured was commendable, but, of course, in need of expansion and further refinement when war engulfed the nation 2 months later. Quote, "It multiplied its communications intelligence manpower 30-fold from its strength December 7, 1941, of 331, 44 officers, and 137 enlisted men and civilians in Washington, and 150 officers and men in the field. Ever-growing requirements quickly dwarfed early estimates, such as the early one in 1942 that a staff of 460 would suffice, and kept up a relentless pressure for more and still more workers. Yet the agency faced stiff competition for them in manpower-short Washington. Moreover, the necessity for employees to be of unquestionable loyalty and trustworthiness because of the sensitive nature of cryptanalytic results and the importance of their being temperamentally suited to the highly specialized nature of the work greatly reduced the number of prospects. To fill its needs, the agency launched a series of vigorous but discreet recruiting drives. It snatched people out of its school even though they were only partially trained. During the school's entire time at Fort Monmouth, New Jersey, not one student completed the full 48-week course. It brought in members of the Women's Army Corps, almost 1,500 of them. These measures enabled the agency to grow to a strength of 10,609 at its peak on January 1, 1945, 5,565 civilians, 4,428 enlisted men and WACs, and 796 officers. This figure excludes cryptologic personnel serving under theater commanders overseas. Nevertheless, the personnel supply never caught up to the demand. In April 1944, for example, the agency had more than 1,000 civilian positions empty. End quote. Personnel growth, new functions, and the pressures of war also dictated new structure of the cryptological unit. Quote, in June of 1942, owing to a reorganization of the Office of the Chief Signal Officer, the outfit shed its old name of Signal Intelligence Service and gained and lost 3 new ones within 2 months. Then, from July 1942 to July 1943, it was called the Signal Security Service, and from July 1943 to the end of the war, the Signal Security Agency. Lieutenant Colonel Rex Minkler, chief since before Pearl Harbor, was replaced in April 1942 by Lieutenant Colonel Frank W. Bullock. In February 1943, Lieutenant Colonel W. Preston Red Quarterman, tall, husky, quiet, pleasant, who had studied and then taught in the SIS school in the 1936, became chief. He remained in the post to the end of the war, rising to a brigadier general in June 1945. Its population explosion and its voluminous output strained its administrative structure, and this was realigned several times. As of Pearl Harbor, it was divided into 4 sections: the A, or administrative, the B, or cryptanalytic, the C, or cryptographic, and the D, or laboratory. End quote. While the B section broke ciphers and decoded messages, the C section devised new codes, ciphers, and related materials for the American military forces. In August of 1942, an E, or communications section, was created by upgrading the traffic subsection of the cryptanalytic unit. In March 1943, the 6 sections were elevated to branch status, and by the following year, a machine branch, mechanized coding, decoding operations, and an information and liaison branch were added. In June of 1942, the Navy ceded all supervision and responsibility for Japanese diplomatic code solutions to the Army, surrendering both files and machinery at this time. In addition to its central coding-decoding operations in Washington, the Signal Intelligence Service established cryptanalytic units in various theaters of the war, received tactical, combat-level communications intelligence via the Signal Corps radio intelligence companies in the field, and maintained an active radio intercept program through the 2nd Signal Service Battalion, later the 9420th Technical Service Unit. Quote, though this setup held until the war ended, operational control of the agency passed on December 15, 1944, to G2, the Military Intelligence Section of the War Department General Staff, which was the agency's major customer and which, as such, for many months, had indirectly guided its activities. The Signal Corps merely retained administrative control. This confusing arrangement, complicated further by the agency's having both staff and command functions, ended in August 1945 when the War Department transferred all signal intelligence units to agency control. On September 6th, 4 days after the war ended, the War Department ordered the creation within G2 of a new cryptologic organization by merging the Signal Security Agency, the Field Cryptanalytic Units, and Signal Corps Cryptology. This was the Army Security Agency, which came into existence September 15, 1945. End quote. The Allied Intelligence Bureau, composed of combined Allied forces in the Pacific Command Zone of General Douglas MacArthur, was established at Brisbane, Australia, on July 6, 1942, under the auspices of his intelligence staff, headed by Major General Charles A. Willoughby. According to MacArthur's records, which Willoughby has cited, quote, "The history of the AIB is a secret, little publicized, but highly important chapter in the story of the Southwest Pacific. From the Solomons to Borneo, from Java to the Philippines, a small adventurous group of carefully trained specialists spread a network of observers and operatives behind the enemy lines well in advance of our main body. Operating in almost total isolation and normally without hope of outside support, every expedition was carried out in the face of great personal risk. If discovered by the enemy, the small parties were doomed to almost certain capture and probable death. In that event, those who died quickly were fortunate. Jungle-wise coast watchers with tiny radio transmitter receiver outfits remained behind as the Japanese invasion wave swept forward. From these few fearless men, a powerful network of sea, air, and ground spotters was developed, until finally it became impossible for the enemy to make a single major move on the surface or in the sky without intelligence reports being flashed in advance to Allied forces. At the conclusion of the desperate Guadalcanal campaign, Admiral Halsey publicly stated that it was probable that the Allies could not have retained their hard-won initiative on Guadalcanal Island had it not been for the consistent advance radio warnings by AIB agents of impending enemy air attacks. End quote. Footnote: Charles A. Willoughby and John Chamberlain, MacArthur, 1941 through 1951. New York, McGraw-Hill Book Company, 1954. Pages 145 and 146. End footnote. The Bureau was headed by Colonel C.J. Roberts, an Australian, with Lieutenant Allison End, an American, as his deputy. The principal structural units included a British Special Operations, Sabotage and Silent Killing Group, a British Radio Monitoring Outfit, the Netherlands Indies Forces Intelligence Service, an Australian Propaganda Group, and the Australian Coast Watchers. Footnote: Allison End, Allied Intelligence Bureau, New York, David McKay Company, pages 10 and 11. End footnote. MacArthur's records comment, quote, "It was found necessary to adjust the organizational structure on a geographic rather than a purely functional basis, primarily to protect and reconcile political sovereignties. A very interesting figure emerged in the often delicate negotiations. One Mr. van der Plas, a former governor of Eastern Java, related to native princes and a top-flight diplomat. His persuasive formula was the division of the vast Southwest Pacific along colonial lines, preserving the pre-war status quo. Colonel Van S. Merle Smith, G2 deputy, who had handled million-dollar New York corporations before the war, was just the tough hombre to cut his way through tropical ambitions. The chiefs of the various AIB sections were placed under an Australian comptroller, who, in turn, was responsible to G2 headquarters. An American deputy comptroller was inserted as the finance officer. Thus, we retained a double check upon the Bureau and its elusive international components. A coordinating staff, consisting of liaison officers from each headquarters, was named to assist the organization. Running true to form, though ostensibly under a single directorship, each of the subsections attempted to remain more or less autonomous, and continuous readjustments were necessary during the lifetime of the Bureau in order to achieve centralized control." End quote. The total manpower in the service of the AIB has been estimated at several thousand individuals. More concrete statistics indicate 164 Bureau operatives lost their lives during the war, while the fate of 178 other agents remains a mystery. 75 Bureau members were captured. While a precise date for the termination of the AIB is not available, it certainly had ceased operations by VJ Day. This is Our Hidden History